I was standing in Jessica's perfectly manicured backyard, clutching a glass of lukewarm punch, while 30 women in designer dresses whispered behind manicured hands about my latest disappointment. The baby shower was in full swing, pink and gold balloons swaying gently in the riverside breeze, but I might as well have been invisible. Again, my sister Jessica sat like a queen on her throne of presents, her pregnant belly draped in a flowing cream dress that probably cost more than my rent, while I stood near the gift table in my department store outfit trying to blend into the hydrangeas. I could hear fragments of their conversations drifting over the gentle hum of suburban judgment. Poor Sarah, still single at 32. Did you hear about her latest business venture? Another failure. I wonder when she'll finally get her act together like Jessica did. The words stung because they weren't entirely wrong. My graphic design freelance work had been struggling, my last relationship had ended 6 months ago, and standing here surrounded by successful married women with their perfect lives, I felt like a cautionary tale wrapped in clearance rack clothing. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Mitchell, and for most of my life, I've been the family disappointment. Not the dramatic kind that gets attention through rebellion or scandal, but the quiet kind that gets forgotten at holiday dinners and excluded from important conversations. Jessica has always been the golden daughter, the one who did everything right at exactly the right time. She graduated summa cum laude from UC Berkeley while I struggled through community college. She landed a high-paying real estate job at 24, while I was still figuring out what I wanted to do with my life. She married Tom, a successful lawyer, in a Pinterest-perfect wedding at Sunset Hills Country Club, while I was still recovering from my second breakup. And now, at 29, she was having the first grandchild while I was approaching 33 with nothing but a struggling design business and a studio apartment to show for it. The comparison game had been going on so long that it felt like breathing. Every family gathering became a performance where Jessica's achievements were spotlighted while my struggles were either ignored or whispered about with barely concealed disappointment. Mom would beam about Jessica's latest real estate sale while barely acknowledging the logo design I'd created for a local restaurant. Dad would proudly introduce Tom as his son-in-law, the attorney, while introducing me simply as his other daughter, Sarah. The message was always clear without being spoken. Jessica was the success story, and I was still working on becoming one. But today felt different. Today, as I watched Jessica open her third luxury stroller and accept congratulations on her perfect life, something inside me shifted. Maybe it was the way Karen Henderson had looked me up and down before asking if I was still doing my little art projects. Maybe it was overhearing Stephanie Williams tell someone that at least one Mitchell daughter had figured out how to land a husband. Or maybe it was the moment my own mother had introduced me to a newcomer as Jessica's sister, not by my own name, but as an extension of someone else's identity. Whatever it was, I felt something crack inside my chest, not from sadness this time, but from a strange kind of clarity. For years I had accepted their narrative about my life. I had internalized their measurements of success and found myself lacking. I had shrunk myself to fit their expectations while simultaneously failing to meet them, creating a lose-lose situation where I was both too much and not enough. But standing there in Jessica's backyard, watching her accept praise for achieving milestones that felt as foreign to me as speaking Mandarin, I realized something important. Their definition of success had never included the possibility that I might be building something different, something that couldn't be measured in wedding photos or salary figures. The baby shower continued around me, like a carefully choreographed performance of suburban perfection. Women I'd known since high school air-kissed and complimented each other's Botox while their children were probably at home with nannies or babysitters. They talked about vacation homes and private schools and renovation projects with the casual entitlement of people who had never had to choose between paying rent and buying groceries. Jessica floated among them, like she'd been born for this role, graciously accepting gifts and attention with the practiced ease of someone who had never doubted she deserved both. I remembered being 12 years old when Jessica was 8, watching her perform in the school talent show while I sat in the audience with our parents. She sang a Disney song with perfect pitch and natural stage presence while I had been too shy to even audition. Mom and Dad had jumped to their feet applauding while I clapped politely, already understanding that some people were meant to be in the spotlight while others were meant to hold the programs. That night, Jessica got ice cream and praise while I got a pat on the head and a casual comment about how proud they were of both their girls, even though only one of us had done anything worth celebrating. The pattern had continued through high school, where Jessica was homecoming princess while I was in the photography club, through college where she was sorority president while I worked part-time jobs to pay for my art supplies, and into adulthood where she collected achievements like trophies while I collected rejection letters and failed attempts at building something meaningful. But somewhere between watching her cut the baby shower cake and listening to another round of toasts about what a wonderful mother she would be, I started to wonder if I had been playing the wrong game entirely. My phone buzzed in my purse, and I discreetly checked it while pretending to admire the gift table arrangements. It was a text from Marcus, the man I'd been quietly seeing for the past few months. The relationship was still new enough that I hadn't mentioned him to my family, partly because I wasn't sure where it was going, and partly because I couldn't bear another round of questions about why this one might be different from the others. His message was simple: hope the shower isn't too brutal. Remember what we talked about last night, you're stronger than you think. Last night, over dinner at a small Italian.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Italian restaurant downtown, Marcus had listened to me vent about the upcoming baby shower and my anxiety about facing another family gathering where I would inevitably be found wanting. He had a way of listening that made me feel heard rather than judged, asking questions that helped me understand my own feelings, rather than offering solutions I hadn't asked for. When I'd confessed that I sometimes felt like a failure compared to Jessica's obvious success, he'd looked at me with genuine confusion. Success according to who? He had asked. Because from where I'm sitting, you're building a creative business from nothing, you're independent, you're kind, and you're brave enough to keep trying even when things get hard. That sounds pretty successful to me. His words had felt foreign because they described a version of me that I rarely saw in my family's reactions, but they also felt true in a way that surprised me. Now standing in Jessica's backyard, while she opened her 15th gift, I found myself thinking about Marcus's perspective. What if the problem wasn't that I was failing at life, but that I was measuring my life against someone else's blueprint? What if Jessica's version of success wasn't the only valid one, and what if my struggles weren't evidence of inadequacy, but proof that I was brave enough to try a different path? The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the perfectly trimmed trees as the gift opening reached its crescendo. Jessica had accumulated an impressive pile of presents, high-end baby clothes, expensive gear, luxury items that cost more than I made in a month. Each gift was met with appropriate enthusiasm and gratitude, photographed for social media, and carefully arranged for maximum visual impact. It was a masterclass in performed happiness, and Jessica was clearly the star student. I found myself studying the other women at the party, trying to understand what I was missing. Were they genuinely happy with their lives, or were they all just better actors than I was? Did Karen Henderson really love spending her days managing her husband's social calendar and coordinating playdates, or had she simply accepted that this was what women like her were supposed to want? Was Stephanie Williams fulfilled by her role as a doctor's wife and charity event organizer, or was she playing a part she'd been assigned so long ago that she'd forgotten it was a costume? For the first time, I wondered if my inability to fit into their world wasn't a flaw but a feature. Maybe my discomfort at these gatherings wasn't evidence that something was wrong with me, but proof that I was designed for something different. Maybe my unconventional path wasn't a series of failures, but a series of brave attempts to build a life that actually fit who I was rather than who I was supposed to be. The realization felt both liberating and terrifying. If I stopped trying to measure up to Jessica's achievements, if I stopped accepting my family's definition of success, then I would have to figure out what my own definition looked like. I would have to trust that my instincts about what mattered were valid, even when everyone around me seemed to disagree. I would have to be willing to disappoint people who were already disappointed in me, which felt redundant but also strangely empowering. As Jessica started her thank you speech, expressing gratitude for the love and support of all the amazing women in her life, I made a decision that surprised me with its clarity. I wasn't going to keep apologizing for not being her. I wasn't going to keep shrinking myself to fit into spaces that were never designed for someone like me. And I wasn't going to keep accepting the scraps of attention and approval that my family doled out when they remembered I existed. Standing there in the golden afternoon light, surrounded by the gentle hum of satisfied suburbanites, I felt something shift inside me that I couldn't quite name yet. It wasn't anger exactly, though there was definitely some of that. It wasn't revenge, though I suspected that might come later. It was more like waking up after a long sleep and realizing that the dream I'd been having wasn't actually mine. I had been living someone else's story about who I was supposed to be, and it was time to start writing my own. Growing up in the Mitchell household meant understanding your role early and playing it consistently. Jessica had claimed the spotlight before she could walk, and I had learned to find comfort in the shadows before I understood there were other places to stand. Our house on Maple Street was a showcase of Jessica's achievements from kindergarten through college. Piano recital photos lined the hallway, honor roll certificates covered the refrigerator, and her high school valedictorian speech still sat framed on Dad's desk at Mitchell & Associates, the accounting firm where he'd always hoped one of his daughters would join him someday. That daughter was never going to be me. While Jessica had inherited Dad's head for numbers and Mom's natural charisma, I had somehow ended up with a combination of artistic sensibilities and social awkwardness that made me feel like a foreign exchange student in my own family. I spent my childhood drawing in corners while Jessica commanded attention at the center of every room. She was the daughter who brought home report cards that made our parents beam with pride, while I brought home art projects that made them smile politely and ask if I'd finished my real homework yet. The dynamics had crystallized by the time we reached high school. Jessica was student body treasurer, captain of the debate team, and homecoming princess all in 1 year. She dated the quarterback, got early admission to Berkeley, and somehow managed to maintain a social life that seemed effortless, while keeping grades that guaranteed her academic scholarships. I was the girl with purple streaks in her hair, who spent lunch periods in the art room, and whose biggest social achievement was being elected secretary of the photography club, a position I mainly got because nobody else wanted to take meeting notes. Mom and Dad weren't cruel about the differences between us, but they weren't subtle either. They attended Jessica's debate tournaments with homemade signs and proud smiles, while treating my art shows like pleasant obligations that required polite attendance but not enthusiastic participation. When Jessica announced she was majoring in business at Berkeley, Dad opened a bottle of champagne. When I declared my intention to study graphic design at Riverside Community College, Mom suggested I also take some practical courses in case the art thing didn't work out. The family business had always been positioned as Jessica's inheritance. Mitchell & Associates specialized in small business accounting, and Dad had dreams of expanding into financial consulting with Jessica as his eventual partner. The plan was so obvious that nobody bothered discussing it. Jessica would graduate, work for a few years to gain experience, then join the firm as junior partner before eventually taking over when Dad retired. It was a neat logical progression that made perfect sense for everyone except me, who had never shown the slightest interest in numbers beyond calculating whether I could afford art supplies after paying rent. But Jessica had surprised everyone by choosing real estate over accounting. She'd graduated from Berkeley and immediately gotten her real estate license, joining one of Riverside's most prestigious agencies instead of the family firm. Dad had been disappointed but proud, especially when Jessica started bringing in six-figure commissions selling luxury homes to tech executives relocating from San Francisco. She had a natural talent for reading people and knowing exactly what they wanted to hear, skills that translated perfectly into convincing wealthy couples that a 4-bedroom house in Riverside was exactly what their growing families needed. Tom had entered the picture during Jessica's second year in real estate. He was a corporate attorney who specialized in mergers and acquisitions, the kind of man who wore expensive suits and drove a BMW and fit seamlessly into the upscale social circles that Jessica had always seemed destined to join. Their courtship had been swift and efficient, like a business merger between two successful brands. 6 months of dinner dates at expensive restaurants, a proposal at the Sunset Hills Country Club during the annual charity gala, and a wedding that made the society pages of the Riverside Press Enterprise. I had been Jessica's maid of honor, a role that felt more ceremonial than meaningful. She had chosen 3 bridesmaids from her college sorority and her real estate office, women who shared her interests in designer handbags and yoga classes and weekend trips to Napa Valley. I had stood at the altar in a lavender dress that Jessica had chosen, holding a bouquet of flowers that complemented her color scheme, feeling like an actress playing a part in someone else's movie. The photographer had taken hundreds of pictures that day, and in most of them, I looked like someone who had wandered into the wrong wedding by mistake. The years since Jessica's marriage had only widened the gap between our lives. She and Tom had bought a house in Riverside's most desirable neighborhood, a place with a 3-car garage and a backyard designed for entertaining. They joined the country club, took couples vacations to places like Cabo and Aspen, and seemed to effortlessly navigate the social obligations that came with their elevated status. Jessica's Instagram feed was a carefully curated display of their perfect life: dinner parties with beautiful people, weekend getaways to wine country, and professional photos that made their everyday moments look like magazine spreads. Meanwhile, I was living in a studio apartment above a coffee shop on Oak Avenue, splitting my time between freelance design work and a part-time job at an art supplies store to make ends meet. My social circle consisted mainly of other struggling artists and creative types who met at coffee shops to complain about clients who wanted logo designs for $50 and expected unlimited revisions. My longest relationship had lasted 8 months, and ended when my boyfriend decided he needed to focus on his music career without the distraction of a girlfriend who also had creative ambitions. The contrast between our lives wasn't lost on our extended family. Aunt Patricia, Dad's sister, who lived in Orange County, never failed to update me on Jessica's latest achievements whenever she visited. "Jessica's selling houses in the $1 million range now," she would say with obvious pride, "and that husband of hers just made partner at his firm. They're really building something special together." The unspoken comparison was always clear: Jessica was building something special, while I was still trying to figure out what I wanted to build at all. Cousin Michelle, who worked as a nurse in Los Angeles, had a gentler way of highlighting the differences between Jessica and me, but the effect was the same. She would ask about my art with genuine interest, then inevitably transition to questions about whether I was dating anyone or thinking about settling down. The assumption was always that my creative pursuits were temporary, something I would outgrow once I found the right man and started focusing on more serious life goals like marriage and children. Even our family friends had developed patterns of interaction that reinforced the established hierarchy. Karen Henderson, who had known our family since we were children, always greeted Jessica with enthusiasm, and me with polite interest. She would spend 20 minutes hearing about Jessica's latest real estate deals, and 5 minutes asking if I was still doing my artwork, a question that managed to sound both supportive and dismissive simultaneously. Stephanie Williams, whose husband was a doctor at Riverside General, would invite Jessica to charity events and book clubs while extending courtesy invitations to me that we both knew I wouldn't accept. The social geography of Riverside had evolved around these established relationships over the years. There was Jessica's world of successful professionals and their wives, people who spent their weekends at wine tastings and charity functions and dinner parties, where the conversation centered around vacation destinations and home renovation projects. Then there was my world of coffee shops and art galleries and community theater productions, places where people talked about creative projects and social justice issues, and the struggle to make meaningful work in a world that seemed to value profit over passion. Occasionally these worlds would intersect at family gatherings or community events, and the differences would become starkly apparent. Jessica would arrive at these functions looking effortlessly put together, greeting everyone with the practiced charm of someone who had never met a social situation she couldn't navigate successfully. I would arrive feeling overdressed or underdressed, or just wrong somehow, gravitating toward conversations with the other outsiders, while Jessica held court at the center of whatever group had formed around her natural magnetism. The pregnancy announcement had come at Easter dinner 3 months ago, delivered with the theatrical timing that Jessica had perfected over the years. She and Tom had arrived at Mom and Dad's house with a gift bag for our parents, watching with obvious delight as they unwrapped a picture frame containing an ultrasound photo and a note that read, "Coming this fall, your first grandchild." Mom had burst into tears of joy, while Dad had immediately started talking about setting up a college fund. I had smiled and offered congratulations while feeling something twist in my stomach that I couldn't quite identify at the time. The months that followed had been a masterclass in pregnancy as performance art. Jessica had documented every milestone with professional photos, announced the gender with the elaborate reveal party, and planned the baby shower with the attention to detail usually reserved for state dinners. She had registered at 3 different high-end stores, created a carefully curated wish list that included items I'd never heard of, and sent out invitations that looked more like wedding announcements than casual party invites. Standing in her backyard now, surrounded by women who moved through this world like they had been born to it, I finally understood what that twisted feeling in my stomach had been. It wasn't jealousy exactly, though there was some of that. It wasn't resentment, though I couldn't deny that element either. It was recognition. I was watching Jessica achieve another milestone that would further cement her position as the successful daughter, while simultaneously highlighting my continued failure to reach the benchmarks that mattered to our family. But for the first time, I found myself questioning whether those benchmarks were actually worth reaching. Part 3: The Turning Point Declaration. The baby shower was winding down as the afternoon sun began its descent behind the perfectly manicured hedges that separated Jessica's backyard from her equally perfect neighbors. I had spent the last hour helping clean up gift wrap and collecting empty plates, while the other guests said their goodbyes with air kisses and promises to get together soon for lunch. Most of the women had already left, leaving behind only the inner circle of family and Jessica's closest friends to handle the aftermath of what had been declared a tremendously successful event. Mom was organizing the gifts into categories, while Jessica documented each present with her phone, no doubt preparing for the social media posts that would extend the celebration into the digital realm, where her followers could participate in her joy from a distance. Aunt Patricia was washing serving dishes in Jessica's pristine kitchen, while offering unsolicited advice about baby sleep schedules and feeding routines. The whole scene felt like a well-rehearsed play where everyone knew their lines except me. I found myself standing near the gift table, mechanically folding discarded ribbon, while watching my family move through the cleanup routine with practiced efficiency. This was their world, I realized, watching Mom coordinate the logistics with the same attention to detail she brought to organizing Dad's business calendar. These were their people, evidenced by the easy way Aunt Patricia navigated Jessica's kitchen, as if she belonged there. This was their version of success, demonstrated by the hundreds of dollars worth of baby gear that now filled Jessica's living room like offerings at a shrine. And I was the outsider, helpful enough to be useful, but peripheral enough to be forgotten when the real decisions were being made. I had been assigned the role of supportive sister years ago, and I had played it so consistently that everyone had forgotten it was a performance rather than my genuine personality. I had learned to smile at the right moments, ask the appropriate questions, and express enthusiasm for achievements that felt as foreign to me as ancient history. But something had shifted during the party, some internal compass that had been pointing toward their version of North for 32 years, had finally begun to question whether their direction was the only valid one. Watching Jessica hold court earlier, accepting congratulations with the grace of someone who had never doubted she deserved them, I had felt something crack inside me that wasn't entirely unpleasant. It was the sound of a shell breaking, of something that had been cramped finally finding room to expand. The realization had been building all afternoon, like storm clouds gathering on a clear day. Every time someone had asked what I was up to these days, with that particular tone that implied my activities were quaint but not quite serious. Every time I had watched Jessica effortlessly navigate conversations about mortgages and investment portfolios and private school options. Every time I had felt like an anthropologist studying a culture I could observe but never truly join, the pressure had increased until something had to give. Standing there with a handful of discarded ribbon, watching my family celebrate Jessica's next achievement while barely acknowledging my presence, I made a decision that surprised me with its clarity. I was done pretending to want what they wanted. I was done apologizing for not reaching milestones that had never been my goals in the first place. I was done playing the role of the disappointing daughter who was still trying to get her act together when the truth was that my act was perfectly together, just not in a way they recognized or valued. The decision felt both terrifying and liberating, like standing at the edge of a cliff and realizing you had wings you'd never tried to use. For years I had accepted their assessment of my life as evidence that I was doing something wrong, that my struggles with traditional success meant I was somehow deficient. But what if the problem wasn't that I was failing at their game, but that I had been trying to play the wrong game entirely? Marcus had planted the seed of this idea during our dinner conversation, but it had taken the surreal experience of this baby shower to make it bloom into something I could actually see. Watching these women celebrate achievements that felt as appealing to me as dental surgery, listening to conversations about topics that made my eyes glaze over with boredom, I had finally understood that my discomfort wasn't evidence of inadequacy, but proof that I was designed for something different. The revelation was both simple and revolutionary. What if there was nothing wrong with me? What if my inability to fit into their world wasn't a flaw that needed fixing, but a signal that I belonged somewhere else entirely? What if my struggles weren't evidence of failure, but proof that I was brave enough to keep trying when the easy path didn't feel right? I looked around Jessica's backyard, taking in the scene with new eyes. The perfectly coordinated decorations, the careful attention to social media documentation, the conversations that revolved around status symbols and social positioning, it all felt like an elaborate performance designed to convince everyone that this was what happiness looked like. But I found myself wondering if anyone in this perfect tableau was actually happy, or if they were all just very good at playing their assigned roles. Jessica herself seemed genuinely content with her life, but even she had moments when I caught her looking slightly lost, as if she were trying to remember why she had wanted something so badly once she'd achieved it. Tom was successful and respected, but he always seemed to be checking his phone for the next crisis that required his attention. Mom and Dad were proud of Jessica's achievements, but they also seemed perpetually anxious about maintaining the lifestyle and social standing that those achievements represented. For the first time, I allowed myself to consider the possibility that my different path wasn't a wrong path, just an uncommon one.
What if my artistic sensibilities weren't a hobby I needed to outgrow, but a core part of who I was meant to be? What if my struggles with traditional milestones weren't evidence of immaturity but proof that I was following my instincts instead of other people's expectations? What if my unconventional life wasn't a failure to launch but a successful rejection of a launch pad that was never designed for someone like me? The more I thought about it, the more obvious it became that I had been living my life as if I were constantly auditioning for a role I didn't actually want. Every family gathering had become a performance where I tried to demonstrate that I was making progress toward goals that didn't actually interest me. Every conversation about my future had been an exercise in defending choices that felt right to me but looked wrong to everyone else. Every achievement had been measured against benchmarks that had nothing to do with what actually mattered to me. But what did matter to me? The question was both liberating and terrifying because I realized I had spent so many years trying to want what I was supposed to want that I had lost track of what I actually wanted. I knew I loved creating things, whether it was designing logos for small businesses or painting in my spare time or even arranging flowers in ways that made people stop and look twice. I knew I valued authenticity over performance, substance over style, genuine connection over social networking. I knew I would rather struggle doing something meaningful than succeed doing something that felt empty. Standing there in Jessica's backyard, I felt something solidify inside me that had been liquid and uncertain for years. I was done trying to fit into spaces that weren't designed for me. I was done apologizing for not achieving things I had never wanted to achieve. I was done accepting other people's definitions of success when those definitions had nothing to do with what actually made me feel alive and purposeful. The decision felt momentous and quiet at the same time, like a tree falling in a forest where I was the only witness. Nobody else at the party noticed that anything had changed, but I could feel the shift in my bones, in the way I stood, in the way I looked at the perfectly coordinated chaos around me. I wasn't angry at Jessica for succeeding at things that came naturally to her, and I wasn't resentful of my parents for being proud of achievements they understood. But I was done pretending that their version of success was the only valid one, and I was done accepting the role of disappointing daughter in their family narrative. From now on, I was going to write my own story, even if it looked nothing like the stories everyone expected me to tell. I was going to pursue work that excited me even if it didn't pay well, form relationships that nourished me even if they didn't look traditional, and create a life that felt authentic even if it appeared unconventional to outside observers. I was going to stop explaining myself to people who were determined to misunderstand me, and I was going to start trusting my own instincts about what mattered. The transformation felt both sudden and inevitable, like finally admitting something I had known for years but had been too afraid to acknowledge. I wasn't like Jessica, and that wasn't a problem that needed solving. I was like me, and that was enough. Part 4. Pattern Documentation. The pattern of my invisibility in the Mitchell family didn't begin with this baby shower or even with Jessica's marriage to Tom. It had roots that stretched back to my earliest memories, a consistent thread woven through decades of family interactions that I had learned to accept as normal until today, when I finally saw it clearly for what it was. When I was 7 years old, Jessica was 3, and our family took a trip to Disneyland that became legendary in Mitchell family. Jessica had spotted a princess dress in one of the gift shops and had thrown what our parents fondly remembered as the most adorable tantrum in family history. She had insisted that she couldn't possibly enjoy the rest of the vacation without that particular dress, complete with tears that sparkled like diamonds and a performance that drew amused smiles from other parents rather than embarrassed frustration. Mom and Dad had bought the dress, of course, along with matching shoes and a tiara that caught the light whenever Jessica moved her head. The rest of the vacation had been documented through hundreds of photos of Jessica twirling in her princess outfit while I stood nearby in my regular clothes, smiling dutifully at the camera. When we got home, Mom had created an entire photo album dedicated to Jessica's princess adventure, and the story had been retold at family gatherings for years afterward as evidence of Jessica's natural charisma and star quality. What nobody remembered because nobody had thought to document it was that I had wanted a princess dress too. I had stood in that gift shop looking at the rack of sparkly gowns with the same longing that Jessica had expressed so dramatically, but I had also understood, even at 7, that asking for something after Jessica had already claimed the spotlight would be greedy and inappropriate. So I had stayed quiet, and my silence had been interpreted as lack of interest rather than learned invisibility. The princess dress incident had established a pattern that would repeat throughout our childhood with minor variations but consistent themes. Jessica's wants were dramatic and immediate and somehow always legitimate, while mine were quiet and easily overlooked and often dismissed as less urgent. When Jessica wanted piano lessons, we immediately researched teachers and instruments and practice schedules. When I expressed interest in art classes, Mom suggested I try drawing on my own first to see if I really stuck with it before investing in formal instruction. By the time we reached elementary school, our roles were firmly established. Jessica was the performer who thrived on attention and somehow always deserved it, while I was the responsible one who could be counted on to entertain herself and not cause problems. Jessica's school programs were events that required multiple cameras and proud grandparents, while mine were obligations that one parent would attend while the other stayed home with Jessica if she didn't feel like sitting through someone else's moment. The imbalance became more pronounced during our teenage years when Jessica's social life exploded into a complex network of friends and activities and achievements that required constant parental support and coordination. Mom became Jessica's manager, driving her to debate tournaments and drama rehearsals and social events that seemed to multiply weekly. Dad became her biggest fan, attending every competition and celebration with the enthusiasm of a sports parent whose child was destined for greatness. Meanwhile, I was learning to navigate high school with minimal parental involvement, not because they didn't care, but because Jessica's needs were so much more immediate and dramatic than mine. When I made the honor roll, it merited a proud mention at the dinner table. When Jessica made the honor roll, it resulted in a celebration dinner at her favorite restaurant and a social media post that generated dozens of congratulatory comments. The pattern wasn't malicious, which somehow made it worse than if they had been deliberately playing favorites. Instead, it was the natural result of two very different personalities requiring different levels of attention and support. Jessica was a flower that bloomed under spotlights, while I was more like a tree that grew steadily in whatever light was available. The problem was that everyone assumed the tree didn't need any special care, because it seemed to be doing fine on its own. College had provided a temporary reprieve from the constant comparisons, mainly because Jessica and I were in different cities pursuing different goals. For 4 blissful years, I had been able to develop my own identity without constantly measuring myself against Jessica's achievements. I had discovered that I was actually quite capable when I wasn't competing for attention with someone who was naturally gifted at claiming it. I had made friends who valued my quiet humor and artistic sensibilities, dated people who appreciated my authenticity over my sister's polished charm, and slowly begun to understand who I was when I wasn't trying to be a different version of Jessica. But graduation had brought me back to Riverside, where the old dynamics reasserted themselves with depressing efficiency. Jessica's real estate career was taking off just as I was struggling to establish my freelance design business, creating a stark contrast between her immediate success and my gradual progress. Every family dinner became an opportunity for Jessica to share exciting news about her latest sale or client, while I tried to explain why landing a small logo design project was actually a significant achievement for someone starting from nothing. The engagement announcement had been particularly brutal, not because I wasn't happy for Jessica, but because it had coincided with my own relationship ending and highlighted just how different our romantic lives had become. Jessica had found Tom, a man who complemented her ambitions and enhanced her social status, while I had been dating a series of creative types who were as financially unstable and socially awkward as I was. The comparison wasn't lost on anyone, especially our parents, who had clearly been hoping that I would follow Jessica's example and find someone who could help me get my act together. The wedding planning process had been a year-long reminder of everything I wasn't achieving in my own life. While Jessica organized tastings and fittings and venue tours, I was working retail jobs and taking on freelance projects that barely covered my rent. While she registered for china patterns and appliances that cost more than my monthly income, I was using mismatched dishes and a coffee maker I'd bought at a thrift store. While she planned a honeymoon in Italy, I was saving up for a weekend camping trip that I ultimately couldn't afford to take. But the most painful part of the wedding hadn't been the obvious disparities in our circumstances. It had been the way our extended family had treated the event as a coronation of Jessica's success and by implication, a confirmation of my failure to reach similar milestones. Aunt Patricia had spent the entire reception asking when it would be my turn, as if marriage were a cue that I was holding up through some combination of poor planning and inadequate effort. Cousin Michelle had offered to set me up with eligible men from her hospital, assuming that my single status was the result of limited social opportunities rather than deliberate choice. The years since the wedding had only reinforced these patterns. Jessica and Tom's house purchase had been celebrated as evidence of their smart financial planning and promising future, while my decision to rent a studio apartment had been viewed as a temporary arrangement that I would hopefully outgrow once I started making better life choices. Jessica's promotion to senior agent at her real estate office had been the subject of proud family updates, while my slowly growing client base had been met with polite interest and subtle suggestions that I might want to consider more stable employment. Even my artistic achievements, the things I was actually proud of, had been consistently minimized or misunderstood by my family. When I had designed a logo for a local nonprofit that had won a regional design award, Mom had asked if it paid well rather than expressing pride in the recognition. When I had been featured in a local arts magazine for a mural I had painted downtown, Dad had wondered aloud if this kind of exposure might help me land a job at an advertising agency, completely missing the point that I was trying to build my own practice rather than work for someone else. The pregnancy announcement had been the culmination of this lifelong pattern, the ultimate achievement that Jessica could claim while I remained conspicuously achievement-free in the areas that mattered to our family. Motherhood was the final frontier of traditional success, the role that would cement Jessica's position as the daughter who had figured out how to build a meaningful life, while I continued to struggle with the basics of adulthood. Standing in Jessica's backyard now, surrounded by the evidence of her latest triumph, I could see the entire pattern with startling clarity. Every milestone she reached had been celebrated as proof of her inherent worth, while every milestone I missed had been treated as evidence of my continued failure to mature properly. Every achievement she earned had been shared proudly with extended family and friends, while every achievement I earned had been met with polite acknowledgement and suggestions for how I might do better next time. The pattern wasn't just about favoritism, though that was certainly part of it. It was about fundamental differences in how our family defined success and worth, differences that had made Jessica's path appear golden while casting mine in shadow. But for the first time, I was beginning to question whether their definitions were actually correct, or if they were simply the only ones they had been taught to recognize. Part 5: Escalating Mistreatment. The weeks following Jessica's engagement to Tom had marked a turning point in how my family treated my life choices, though at the time I had been too caught up in my own struggles to recognize the shift for what it was. What I had interpreted as increased concern for my welfare was actually the beginning of a more systematic campaign to pressure me into conforming to their vision of acceptable adult behavior. It had started subtly, the way most forms of emotional manipulation do, with conversations that seemed supportive on the surface but carried undertones of judgment and disappointment. Mom had begun calling me more frequently, ostensibly to check in on how I was doing, but actually to probe for evidence that I was finally taking steps to get my life on track. These conversations always followed the same pattern: polite inquiry about my work, followed by gentle suggestions about other career paths I might consider, concluded with casual mentions of friends' daughters who had recently gotten married or found stable employment. Dad had taken a different approach, offering to help me get established in ways that felt generous until I realized they all involved abandoning my artistic pursuits in favor of more traditional career paths. He had suggested that I might benefit from taking some business courses at the community college, ostensibly to help with my freelance work, but obviously intended to steer me toward more conventional employment. He had offered to introduce me to clients of his accounting firm who might need administrative help, positions that would provide steady income but require me to give up the flexibility that freelance work afforded. The most painful part of their increased attention was how it highlighted their fundamental misunderstanding of what I was trying to build. They saw my freelance design work as a temporary phase I would eventually outgrow, like a hobby that had gotten out of hand rather than a serious attempt to create a sustainable creative career. When I tried to explain that I was slowly building a client base and developing a reputation in the local arts community, they nodded politely but immediately redirected the conversation toward more practical concerns like health insurance and retirement planning. Jessica, meanwhile, had been elevated to the status of family consultant on all matters related to adult success. Her opinions about my life choices were suddenly solicited and shared as if she possessed some special wisdom about navigating the world that I lacked. When I mentioned that I was considering taking on a large mural project that would require several months of work but pay well upon completion, Jessica had advised our parents that I should be more cautious about taking on projects without guaranteed payment schedules. Her concern had been framed as protective sisterly advice, but the effect had been to undermine my judgment and reinforce the idea that I couldn't be trusted to make good decisions about my own career. The escalation had become more obvious after Jessica and Tom's wedding, when my continued single status had apparently become a source of genuine concern rather than polite interest. Family gatherings had begun to feel like intervention meetings where everyone had agreed in advance that something needed to be done about Sarah's situation. Aunt Patricia had started bringing photos of her co-workers' sons to family dinners, presenting them like trading cards of eligible bachelors who might be willing to overlook my unconventional lifestyle in exchange for my other qualities. Cousin Michelle had taken it upon herself to create online dating profiles for me without my permission, arguing that I was obviously too busy with my art projects to properly focus on finding a partner. She had used photos from family events where I looked more conventional than usual, and had written a bio that emphasized my stability and family connections while barely mentioning my creative work. When I had discovered the profiles and demanded that she delete them, she had acted hurt that I wasn't grateful for her help in addressing what she saw as my obvious relationship deficits. The financial pressure had been the most insidious form of escalation because it had been presented as family generosity rather than manipulation. Dad had offered to co-sign a lease on a larger apartment in a nicer neighborhood, ostensibly to help me establish myself more professionally, but actually to move me away from the arts district where I had been building connections with other creative professionals. Mom had suggested that she could help me buy a car to replace my aging Honda, but only if I agreed to use it for a more traditional job that would require reliable transportation. These offers had come with strings attached that would have fundamentally altered the trajectory of my life. The apartment Dad wanted to co-sign was in a suburban complex full of young professionals who worked downtown, people who would have expected me to maintain a lifestyle that required steady employment rather than the feast or famine existence of freelance work. The car Mom wanted to help me buy was a practical sedan that would have been perfect for commuting to an office job but completely wrong for hauling art supplies and equipment to various project sites. When I had declined these generous offers, my family's response had revealed the true purpose behind their concern. Instead of accepting my explanations about why these changes wouldn't fit my current goals, they had become frustrated and defensive, as if my refusal to accept their help was evidence of stubbornness rather than self-awareness. Dad had accused me of being too proud to accept assistance that could help me build a better life, while Mom had worried aloud that I was sabotaging my own future out of some misguided attachment to struggling. The most devastating escalation had occurred 6 months before Jessica's pregnancy announcement, during a family dinner where everyone had apparently decided that subtle pressure wasn't working and direct intervention was necessary. I had arrived at my parents' house expecting a normal Sunday meal, and had instead walked into what felt like a carefully orchestrated confrontation about my life choices. Jessica and Tom had been there, along with Aunt Patricia and her husband, creating an audience that made escape impossible and disagreement seem ungrateful. The conversation had started with innocent questions about my recent projects, but had quickly evolved into a systematic critique of my lifestyle and choices. Why was I still living in that tiny apartment when I could afford something better if I had a steady job? Why was I turning down opportunities to work for established companies in favor of unpredictable freelance projects? Why wasn't I making more effort to meet potential partners, instead of spending all my time with other struggling artists? The questions had been framed as expressions of love and concern, but they had felt like accusations of deliberately choosing failure over success. Every answer I had given had been met with counter-arguments and alternative suggestions, as if my explanations for my choices were evidence of confused thinking rather than thoughtful decision-making. When I had tried to describe the satisfaction I found in creative work and the progress I was making in building my client base, they had listened politely but immediately redirected the conversation toward more practical concerns. The dinner had concluded with what amounted to an ultimatum disguised as a family intervention. Dad had offered me a position at his accounting firm, not doing creative work but handling administrative tasks that would provide steady income and benefits. Mom had volunteered to help me create a more conventional wardrobe and dating profile to improve my prospects for finding a serious relationship. Jessica had suggested that I could rent a room in their future house once they found something with enough space, giving me the stability of a family environment while I figured out what I really wanted to do with my life. The offers had been presented as a coordinated support system designed to help me transition into a more conventional lifestyle, but they had felt like a plan to dismantle everything I had worked to build in favor of a life that looked more like what they thought I should want. When I had declined their comprehensive assistance package, the disappointment in the room had been palpable, as if I had rejected not just their help, but their entire framework for understanding what constituted a successful life. The months that followed had been marked by a subtle but persistent campaign to wear down my resistance to their vision of improvement. Every family interaction had included references to opportunities I was missing, people I should meet, choices I should reconsider. Jessica had begun sharing stories about friends who had given up artistic pursuits in favor of more stable careers and had found happiness in conventional success. Mom had started forwarding job listings for positions that required no creative skills but offered excellent benefits. Dad had begun questioning whether my artistic work was really fulfilling if it caused so much financial stress and uncertainty. The pressure had been relentless but never quite aggressive enough to justify a direct confrontation. It had been death by 1,000 cuts, each individual comment or suggestion reasonable enough in isolation but collectively creating an environment where my choices were constantly questioned and my judgment was consistently undermined. I had begun to dread family gatherings because they had become opportunities for everyone to express their ongoing concern about my failure to mature properly into the kind of adult they recognized and approved of. By the time Jessica had announced her pregnancy, I had already been worn down by months of subtle criticism disguised as loving concern. The baby shower had simply been the culmination of a long campaign to demonstrate that Jessica's path was the right one, while mine remained a cautionary tale of what happened when someone refused to accept good advice and family support. Standing in her backyard, watching her receive congratulations for achieving the ultimate marker of conventional success, I had finally understood that their escalating concern had never been about my happiness or fulfillment. It had been about their discomfort with my refusal to conform to their expectations and their determination to pressure me into compliance rather than accept that I might be capable of defining success differently than they did. The breaking point came 3 weeks after Jessica's baby shower, on a Thursday afternoon that had started like any other, but ended with me staring at my phone screen in complete disbelief. I had been working on a logo design for a small bookstore downtown, the kind of project that didn't pay much but allowed me to create something meaningful for people who genuinely cared about literature and community. The work had been going well, and I had been feeling that rare satisfaction that comes from knowing you're creating something that will make a difference, even if it's a small one. My phone had buzzed while I was fine-tuning the typography, and I had glanced at it expecting to see a text from Marcus or maybe an email from a potential client. Instead, I had found a message from Mom that made my blood freeze in my veins. The message was brief and matter-of-fact, the kind of communication that delivers devastating news in the most casual way possible. Sarah, Jessica is having some complications with the pregnancy and needs to be on bed rest for the next few weeks. She's going to need help with daily tasks and meal preparation. We've talked it over and think it would be best if you moved in with her and Tom temporarily to provide support. This is family emergency situation and we need everyone to step up. Can you be there by Saturday? I had read the message 3 times before its full implications sank in. They had made a decision about my life, my time, and my commitments without consulting me, then presented it as a foregone conclusion disguised as a request. The assumption was that I would immediately drop everything I was working on because Jessica needed help, and that my own responsibilities were less important than her comfort during what was undoubtedly a stressful time. The message had been followed by another one 5 minutes later, this time from Jessica herself. Hey Sarah, I know this is sudden but the doctor says I need complete rest and Tom has to travel for work next week. Mom and Dad suggested you could help out since your schedule is more flexible than everyone else's. I really appreciate you being willing to do this for me. The phrase willing to do this had hit me like a physical blow because it assumed consent I had never given. Jessica had written the message as if I had already agreed to upend my life for her convenience, as if my willingness was so obvious that it didn't need to be confirmed. The casual dismissal of my own schedule as flexible had been particularly insulting because it revealed how little they understood about the discipline and dedication required to maintain a freelance creative practice. I had sat in my apartment for an hour, staring at both messages while trying to process the magnitude of what they were asking.
Moving in with Jessica and Tom would mean abandoning my current projects during critical phases of development, leaving my own space and routines to accommodate someone else's needs, and essentially putting my life on hold for an indefinite period while Jessica recovered from whatever complications she was experiencing. But the real breaking point hadn't been the request itself, unreasonable as it was. It had been the realization that they had made these plans without considering whether I might have my own commitments, my own deadlines, my own life that couldn't simply be paused whenever family drama required my attention. They had discussed my availability as if I were a resource to be deployed rather than a person with agency and autonomy. I had called Mom to explain why I couldn't drop everything to become Jessica's live-in caretaker, thinking that if I
could make her understand the projects I would have to abandon, and the commitments I would have to break, she might realize that her plan wasn't feasible. The conversation had not gone as I had hoped. "Sarah, honey, I understand you have your art projects, but this is about Jessica's health and the health of our first grandchild. Surely your clients will understand that family emergencies take priority over everything else. This is what family members do for each other in times of crisis." The dismissal of my work as art projects had been like a knife between my ribs. Mom had reduced months of careful client relationship building and professional commitment to the level of hobbies that could be set aside whenever more important concerns arose. The assumption that my clients would understand and accommodate my absence revealed how little she valued the professional reputation I had been working years to establish. I had tried to explain that leaving clients hanging during critical project phases would damage my credibility and potentially destroy relationships I had worked hard to build. I had outlined the deadlines I was facing and the financial consequences of breaking commitments I had already made. I had even suggested alternative solutions like hiring a professional caregiver or arranging for Mom to take time off from her part-time job at Dad's office to help Jessica herself. Every suggestion I had made had been dismissed as either too expensive, too complicated, or insufficiently personal. They didn't want professional help, they wanted family help. They didn't want to disrupt their own routines, they wanted me to disrupt mine. They didn't want to spend money on outside assistance, they wanted me to provide free labor disguised as sisterly support. The conversation had escalated when I had finally said the word they apparently didn't want to hear: no. I had explained that while I sympathized with Jessica's situation and wanted to help in whatever way I could, moving in as a full-time caregiver wasn't something I could commit to without destroying my own professional obligations. Mom's response had revealed the true depth of their expectation that I would always be available to subordinate my needs to the family's convenience. "Sarah, I'm very disappointed in you. Jessica has always been there for family when we needed her, and now when she needs us, you're putting your little business ahead of your sister's health. I thought we raised you to understand what family loyalty means." The accusation of disloyalty had been particularly cruel because it reframed my attempt to maintain professional integrity as selfish abandonment. By questioning my family values, Mom had tried to make my reasonable boundary setting appear morally deficient. The characterization of my business as little had been an additional insult, designed to minimize the importance of work that had taken years to develop and represented my only source of income. But the conversation had taken an even more devastating turn when Mom had played what she clearly considered her trump card. "Sarah, Jessica specifically asked for you because she trusts you and wants family around during this difficult time. She could have asked anyone, but she chose you because she believes you care about her well-being. I hope you won't let her down when she's counting on you." The manipulation had been masterful in its cruelty. By framing Jessica's need for help as personal trust and preference, Mom had tried to make my refusal seem like a betrayal of sisterly love, rather than a reasonable response to an unreasonable demand. The implication that refusing to drop everything for Jessica would constitute letting her down had been designed to trigger guilt and override my logical objections to their plan. I had ended the conversation feeling emotionally battered but still determined not to abandon my commitments. I had told Mom that I would try to find ways to help Jessica that didn't require me to move in as a full-time caregiver, and that I hoped she would understand that maintaining my professional obligations wasn't evidence of not caring about family. 20 minutes after hanging up, my phone had rung again. This time it was Dad, which was unusual because he typically left family communication to Mom unless the situation was serious enough to require his intervention. His tone had been disappointment mixed with authority, the voice he had used when I was a teenager who had violated curfew or forgotten important responsibilities. "Sarah, your mother told me about your conversation regarding Jessica's situation. I have to say I'm surprised by your response. When I was building my business, I understood that family emergencies sometimes required personal sacrifices. That's part of being an adult and a family member. I'm hoping you'll reconsider your position and do what's right for Jessica and the baby. Dad's lecture about adult responsibility had been particularly galling because it completely ignored the adult responsibilities I would be abandoning to accommodate their demands. His comparison to his own business building years had been irrelevant because he had never been asked to shut down his practice for weeks to provide unpaid caregiving services to family members. His framing of the situation as a matter of doing what's right had been another attempt to make my reasonable boundaries appear morally questionable. The conversation with Dad had followed the same pattern as the one with Mom, with my attempts to explain my professional obligations being dismissed as excuses and my suggestions for alternative solutions being rejected as inadequate. By the end of the call, I had felt like I was trying to negotiate with people who had already decided that my perspective was invalid and my concerns were irrelevant. The final blow had come in the form of a group text sent to the extended family, apparently designed to apply social pressure where individual conversations had failed to achieve compliance. Aunt Patricia, Cousin Michelle, and several family friends had been included in a message that outlined Jessica's medical situation and explained that the family was rallying to provide support during her time of need. The message had been carefully worded to make anyone who didn't offer immediate assistance appear selfish and uncaring. It had described Jessica's pregnancy complications in dramatic terms that emphasized the potential dangers to both mother and baby. It had portrayed the family's response as a coordinated effort to ensure that Jessica received the love and care she deserved during this challenging time. And it had specifically mentioned that they were hoping Sarah would be able to provide daily assistance given her flexible schedule and close relationship with Jessica. The responses to the group text had been swift and predictably supportive of Jessica while subtly critical of my apparent reluctance to help. Aunt Patricia had replied that she wished she lived closer so she could help more, but that she was glad Jessica had such a caring sister to rely on. Cousin Michelle had shared her own pregnancy complications story and emphasized how important family support had been during her recovery. Several family friends had offered prayers and encouragement while noting how fortunate Jessica was to have family members who could drop everything to help during emergencies. Each response had increased the pressure on me to conform to their expectations while making my position appear increasingly unreasonable. The group text had transformed what should have been a private family discussion into a public referendum on my character and family loyalty. By including extended family and friends in the conversation, they had made my refusal to abandon my commitments a matter of public record and social judgment. The breaking point had finally arrived when Jessica herself had called me that evening, her voice carefully modulated to convey both vulnerability and disappointment. She had started the conversation by thanking me for being willing to help, again assuming consent I hadn't given, then had gradually transitioned into a more emotional appeal designed to override my resistance. "Sarah, I know this is asking a lot, but I'm really scared about these complications and I just feel like I need family around right now. Tom has to travel for work and Mom and Dad both have responsibilities they can't abandon, but you've always been so independent and self-sufficient that I thought maybe your situation was more flexible. I would do the same for you if you were in my position." The conversation had continued for 45 minutes, with Jessica alternating between expressions of gratitude for my anticipated help and subtle implications that my refusal would constitute abandonment during her time of greatest need. She had described her medical situation in detail designed to emphasize its seriousness while downplaying the duration and intensity of the assistance she was requesting. She had repeatedly mentioned how much it would mean to her to have me there, while dismissing my concerns about professional obligations as temporary inconveniences that could easily be rescheduled. By the end of the call, I had felt completely emotionally manipulated and professionally cornered. The family had coordinated their approach to maximize pressure while minimizing my ability to refuse without appearing heartless. They had reframed my reasonable boundary setting as family disloyalty, transformed my professional commitments into selfish inconveniences, and created a social environment where refusing their demands would result in public judgment and private resentment. But the real breaking point hadn't been the manipulation itself, devastating as it was. It had been the moment of clarity that followed, when I realized that this crisis had simply revealed the family dynamics that had always existed beneath the surface of our interactions. They had always expected me to be available for their convenience, always assumed that my time and energy were less valuable than Jessica's, always treated my choices as temporary phases that could be abandoned whenever family needs required my attention. For the first time in my life, I understood that their love for me was conditional on my willingness to play the role they had assigned me, the supportive sister who would always prioritize family needs over personal goals, the flexible one who could be counted on to sacrifice her own interests for the greater good. The reliable backup who would always be available when Jessica needed assistance but never demand similar support for her own challenges. The realization had been both devastating and liberating. It had shattered my illusions about unconditional family love while simultaneously freeing me from the obligation to continue accepting treatment that diminished my worth and dismissed my autonomy. For 32 years I had been trying to earn love that would always be contingent on my willingness to remain invisible except when my services were required. Standing in my apartment that night, looking at the logo design I had been working on before the avalanche of family pressure had descended, I had made a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. I was done accepting the role of convenient family resource. I was done subordinating my professional commitments to other people's emergencies. I was done pretending that their demands were reasonable requests rather than manipulative attempts to maintain a system that benefited them at my expense. I had picked up my phone and composed a message to the family group text, my hands trembling slightly as I typed words I had never imagined myself saying to people I loved. The message was brief and professional, designed to establish boundaries without engaging in the emotional manipulation they had been using against me. After careful consideration, I won't be able to provide the live-in care that's been requested. I'm happy to help Jessica in other ways that don't require me to abandon my current professional commitments. I hope you'll understand that maintaining my business obligations is important to me, and I'm sure we can find alternative solutions that work for everyone. I had sent the message before I could second-guess myself, then had turned off my phone and sat in the silence of my apartment waiting for the emotional storm I knew would follow. For the first time in my adult life, I had said no to my family's demands and I had no idea what the consequences would be. Part 7: Inner Awakening. The silence that followed my refusal to become Jessica's live-in caregiver was unlike anything I had ever experienced in my relationship with my family. It wasn't the comfortable quiet of people who understood and accepted each other's decisions, but the heavy, charged silence of disappointment and judgment hanging in the air like smoke after an explosion. For 3 days my phone didn't ring, my messages went unanswered, and I existed in a strange bubble of isolation that was both peaceful and terrifying. During those 3 days of family silence, something extraordinary happened to my perspective on the situation and on my life in general. Without the constant background noise of their expectations and demands, I began to hear my own thoughts with startling clarity. I realized that for years, I had been living with a kind of emotional static that had made it difficult to distinguish between what I actually wanted and what I thought I should want based on their constant feedback and guidance. The first revelation had come while I was working on the bookstore logo, the project I had been willing to risk family relationships to preserve. As I refined the design, making small adjustments that would help the local business owners communicate their love of literature and community, I realized that this work filled me with a sense of purpose and satisfaction that I had never felt when contemplating the conventional career paths my family had been pushing me toward. Creating something beautiful and functional for people who genuinely needed design help wasn't just a way to pay my bills, it was a way to contribute something meaningful to the world. Every small business that could better communicate its mission because of my work, every nonprofit that could reach more people because of a more effective logo, every local organization that could build stronger community connections through better visual identity, these were real contributions that made a difference in people's lives. The realization had been both obvious and revolutionary. I wasn't failing at building a meaningful career, I was succeeding at building a different kind of meaningful career than the ones my family recognized or valued. My work mattered, not because it generated impressive income or social status, but because it helped other people achieve their goals and serve their communities more effectively. The fact that this work didn't look like traditional success didn't make it less valuable, it made it more authentically aligned with my actual values and interests. The second revelation had come when Marcus had called to check on how I was handling the family situation. I had expected sympathy and support, which he certainly provided, but I hadn't expected the conversation to fundamentally shift my understanding of what healthy relationships looked like.
When I had explained the family's demands and my decision to refuse them, Marcus hadn't questioned my judgment or suggested ways I might compromise to keep everyone happy. Instead, he had validated my decision and expressed concern about the way my family had tried to manipulate me into compliance. "Sarah," he had said, his voice gentle but firm, "what they asked of you wasn't reasonable, and the way they tried to pressure you into agreeing wasn't loving behavior. People who care about your well-being don't try to guilt you into abandoning your commitments and responsibilities. They don't dismiss your work as unimportant or treat your time as less valuable than everyone else's." His words had hit me like a revelation because they had articulated something I had felt but never been able to express clearly. The family's behavior toward me hadn't been protective or caring, it had been controlling and dismissive. Their love had always come with conditions that required me to prioritize their comfort over my own growth, their needs over my own goals, their definition of success over my own sense of purpose. Marcus had continued the conversation by asking questions that I had never thought to ask myself. When was the last time your family supported one of your goals without trying to redirect you towards something they thought would be better for you? When was the last time they celebrated your achievements without immediately suggesting ways you could achieve something bigger or more conventional? When was the last time they treated your judgment about your own life as valid and trustworthy? I had found myself unable to answer any of these questions with recent examples which had been both heartbreaking and illuminating. I couldn't remember a time when my family had simply accepted my choices without trying to improve or redirect them. I couldn't recall conversations where they had expressed genuine curiosity about my work without immediately transitioning to concerns about my financial stability or suggestions for alternative career paths. I couldn't think of instances where they had treated me as a competent adult whose decisions deserved respect rather than as a confused child who needed constant guidance. The third revelation had emerged gradually over the course of the week, as I continued working on various projects while processing the emotional aftermath of my confrontation with the family. I began to notice how different I felt when I was engaged in work that genuinely interested me compared to how I felt when I was trying to meet other people's expectations for my life. When I was designing logos or creating visual materials that helped small businesses communicate their missions more effectively, I felt energized and focused and deeply satisfied with the time I was spending. When I was painting in my spare time or experimenting with new artistic techniques, I felt connected to something larger than myself and genuinely excited about the possibilities for creative expression. When I was having conversations with other artists and creative professionals about their work and challenges, I felt part of a community that understood and valued the kind of contribution I was trying to make. But when I was having conversations with my family about my future plans, when I was attending social events where the primary topics were conventional markers of success, when I was trying to explain my choices to people who fundamentally disagreed with my priorities, I felt drained and defensive and somehow smaller than my actual self. The contrast was so stark that I wondered how I had failed to notice it before. The realization that had followed this observation was perhaps the most important one of all. I had been trying to live two different lives simultaneously, and the effort had been exhausting me for years. I had been trying to pursue work that felt meaningful and authentic while also trying to satisfy people who valued completely different things. I had been trying to build relationships based on mutual respect and shared interests while also trying to maintain family relationships that seemed to require my continued acceptance of diminished status and dismissed autonomy. The impossibility of this dual existence had finally become clear to me during those days of family silence. I couldn't continue trying to earn approval from people who fundamentally disagreed with my life choices while also building a life that actually reflected my values and interests. I couldn't keep seeking validation from people who would only provide it if I abandoned the work and relationships that genuinely nourished me. But the most profound revelation had been about the nature of love itself and what I deserved from the people who claimed to care about me. For years I had accepted conditional love as the only kind available to me, love that was contingent on my willingness to prioritize other people's comfort over my own growth. I had believed that family love meant always being available for other people's emergencies while never expecting similar support for my own challenges. Marcus had helped me understand that healthy love looked completely different from what I had been accepting. Healthy love meant supporting people's genuine goals rather than trying to redirect them toward different goals. It meant respecting people's judgment about their own lives rather than constantly questioning their decisions. It meant celebrating people's achievements rather than immediately suggesting ways they could achieve something better or more conventional.
The conversation with Marcus had continued over several days, not as a single overwhelming discussion, but as a series of gentle explorations that had allowed me to process these revelations at my own pace. He had shared stories about his own family relationships and how he had learned to distinguish between people who genuinely supported his well-being and people who were primarily concerned with their own comfort and convenience. The people who really love you, he had explained, want you to become the best version of yourself, not their preferred version of you. They're interested in understanding what makes you happy and fulfilled, not in convincing you that you should want different things. They celebrate your successes without immediately pointing out areas for improvement, and they support you during challenges without suggesting that you brought them on yourself through poor life choices. These conversations had helped me understand that my family's treatment of me wasn't evidence of my inadequacy or their special wisdom about life. It was evidence of a fundamental incompatibility between what they valued and what actually brought meaning to my existence. They weren't wrong to value financial security, social status, and conventional milestones, but they were wrong to assume that these values should be universally shared, and that my different priorities indicated confusion or immaturity. The week of silence had also given me space to reconnect with friends and colleagues who did understand and support the work I was doing. Diana, my best friend from college who now worked as a freelance photographer, had called to check on a collaborative project we were developing for a local arts festival. Our conversation had reminded me that there were people in my life who valued creativity and authenticity, and who treated my work as legitimate and important. Tom Rodriguez, who owned the bookstore I was designing the logo for, had stopped by my apartment to see the latest iterations and had spent an hour talking about how the visual identity I was creating would help him communicate his vision for creating a community gathering place that celebrated literature and learning. His enthusiasm for the project and his respect for my expertise had reminded me that there were clients who genuinely appreciated what I brought to their work. Even casual interactions with neighbors and acquaintances had felt different during that week, because I had been approaching them from a place of greater self-awareness and confidence, rather than the defensive uncertainty that had characterized my social interactions when I was constantly trying to justify my choices to people who disapproved of them. Without the background anxiety of family disapproval, I had been able to engage with people more authentically, and had discovered that many of them were actually interested in and supportive of the work I was doing. By the end of the week, I had reached a conclusion that felt both inevitable and liberating. I was done trying to earn love and approval from people who could only provide it if I became someone fundamentally different from who I actually was. I was done subordinating my authentic goals to other people's expectations and then wondering why I felt unfulfilled and frustrated. I was done accepting treatment that diminished my worth and dismissed my autonomy in the name of family loyalty. The decision to prioritize my own well-being and authentic goals over my family's approval had felt terrifying at first, like stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. But as the days passed and I continued to feel energized and focused and genuinely excited about my work and my future, the decision had begun to feel less like abandonment and more like coming home to myself. I realized that I had been waiting my entire adult life for permission to fully commit to the work and relationships that actually nourished me, and that permission had never been forthcoming from the people I had been seeking it from. The only person who could give me permission to build an authentic life was myself, and I was finally ready to grant it. Part 8. The Catalyst Event. The catalyst that would transform my quiet personal awakening into unavoidable family drama arrived exactly 10 days after I had refused to become Jessica's live-in caregiver. It came in the form of a phone call from Mom at 7:30 in the morning, her voice tight with the particular combination of panic and accusation that I had learned to recognize as her crisis management tone. "Sarah, I need you to come to the house immediately. Jessica is in the hospital, and Tom is out of town on business, and we have a situation that requires your immediate attention. This isn't negotiable." I had been drinking coffee and reviewing final details on the bookstore logo before my meeting with Tom Rodriguez later that morning, feeling calm and focused in a way that had become more natural since I had started prioritizing my own well-being over family dysfunction. Mom's call had shattered that peace like a rock through a window, instantly triggering the old familiar anxiety that came from being thrust into family drama without warning or context. "What kind of situation?" I had asked, trying to keep my voice level while my heart rate accelerated. "Is Jessica okay? What happened?" "She's fine, the baby is fine, but she had some bleeding last night, and they're keeping her for observation. Tom flew to Chicago yesterday for depositions and won't be back until tomorrow night. But that's not the immediate problem. The immediate problem is that Jessica was supposed to host the hospital auxiliary fundraiser at her house tonight, and we need someone to take over the preparations and manage the event. The request had hit me like a physical blow, not just because of its magnitude, but because of the casual way it had been presented as my obvious responsibility. Jessica's house was supposed to welcome 40 prominent community members for an elegant dinner party that would raise money for new medical equipment at Riverside General Hospital. The event had been planned for months, with catered food, floral arrangements, silent auction items, and entertainment that would showcase Jessica's skills as a hostess, while supporting a worthy cause. Mom, I can't possibly host a fundraiser for 40 people with less than 12 hours notice. I don't know anything about the planning details, I don't have access to Jessica's house, and I have my own commitments today, including a client meeting that I can't reschedule. The words had come out more firmly than I had intended, but I had felt the familiar pattern beginning, and had recognized that I needed to establish boundaries immediately before the
conversation spiraled into manipulation and guilt. The week of silence and self-reflection had given me a clearer understanding of how these family crises typically unfolded, and I had been determined not to get swept into the chaos without maintaining my own agency. Mom's response had been swift and sharp, cutting through my reasonable objections with the efficiency of someone who had already decided that my compliance was inevitable. "Sarah, this is not about what's convenient for you. This is about family reputation and community responsibility. Jessica has worked for months to organize this fundraiser, and canceling at the last minute would be a disaster for both the hospital auxiliary and our family's standing in the community." The conversation had continued for 20 minutes, with Mom alternating between appeals to family loyalty and threats about the consequences of my refusal to step in. She had outlined the catastrophic social and financial implications of canceling the event, described Jessica's devastation at potentially letting down the hospital auxiliary, and emphasized the opportunities for positive community visibility that would be lost if I didn't take over the hosting responsibilities. Every concern I had raised about the practical impossibility of managing such an event with no preparation time had been dismissed as excuses or solved with suggestions that required me to abandon my entire day. When I had mentioned my client meeting, Mom had suggested I could reschedule it, and explained that family emergency took priority. When I had pointed out that I didn't know any of the planning details, she had offered to spend the day walking me through Jessica's notes and preparations. When I had worried about my ability to host such an elegant event, she had assured me that I would rise to the occasion because family members always did what was necessary in times of crisis. The breaking point in the conversation had come when Mom had played her ultimate card, the emotional manipulation that was designed to override all practical objections and moral reservations. "Sarah, Jessica specifically asked that you be the one to take over if something happened to prevent her from hosting. She trusts you to represent the family appropriately and to make sure her hard work doesn't go to waste. She's lying in a hospital bed worried about letting people down, and you're the only one who can give her peace of mind." The claim that Jessica had specifically requested me as her backup host had felt both flattering and suspect, especially given that Jessica had never included me in any of the party planning discussions or sought my input on event management strategies. But the implication that my refusal would directly cause Jessica additional stress while she was hospitalized had been the kind of emotional blackmail that was designed to make resistance feel morally impossible. I had ended the conversation by agreeing to come to Mom and Dad's house to discuss the situation, though I had made it clear that I wasn't committing to taking over the entire event. The compromise had felt reasonable at the time, but I had underestimated the coordinated campaign that awaited me when I arrived at their house 30 minutes later. The scene at my parents' house had been like walking into a war room where the entire family had assembled to address the crisis. Mom and Dad were there, obviously, but so were Aunt Patricia and her husband, who had driven down from Orange County overnight after receiving panicked phone calls about the situation. Cousin Michelle had arrived from Los Angeles with a car full of emergency party supplies and a determined expression that suggested she had already committed to making this event happen regardless of the obstacles. The dining room table had been covered with Jessica's event planning materials, guest lists, vendor contact information, seating charts, menu details, decoration schemes, and timeline schedules that revealed the incredible complexity of what they were asking me to manage. Looking at the sheer volume of coordination required, I had felt my chest tighten with anxiety at the impossibility of executing such an elaborate plan with no experience and minimal preparation time. But the most overwhelming aspect of the scene hadn't been the logistical complexity, it had been the emotional intensity of everyone's expectations and the clear indication that they had already decided I would be taking over the event.
They weren't asking for my help or requesting my assistance, they were briefing me on my new responsibilities and discussing strategies for managing the challenges that my inexperience would create. Aunt Patricia had already called several of Jessica's vendors to confirm delivery times and service details, explaining that there had been a family emergency, but that the event would proceed as planned with a different host. Cousin Michelle had contacted friends who had experience with similar events to see if they could provide last-minute assistance with setup and management. Mom had created an hour-by-hour schedule for my day that included vendor meetings, decoration setup, food preparation oversight, and guest reception duties. The assumption of my compliance had been so complete that they had spent the morning making commitments on my behalf without waiting to see if I would actually agree to take on the responsibility. By the time I had arrived at the house, they had already created a situation where backing out would mean disappointing not just the family but also vendors, volunteers, and community members who had been told that Sarah Mitchell would be managing the event in Jessica's absence. The manipulation had been masterful in its thoroughness and devastating in its effectiveness. They had created a scenario where my refusal to help would cause public embarrassment for the family, financial losses for the hospital auxiliary, and personal disappointment for Jessica during her medical crisis. They had positioned me as the only possible solution to a problem that could have catastrophic consequences if not properly managed. But the moment that had crystallized my understanding of what was really happening hadn't been any of the logistical discussions or emotional appeals. It had been when Dad had pulled me aside for a private conversation that was clearly intended to close the deal on my participation. "Sarah, I know this seems overwhelming, but I think you're underestimating your own capabilities. You've always been organized and creative, and those skills are exactly what this situation requires. More importantly, this is an opportunity for you to show the community what you're capable of when you apply yourself to something important. People will see you successfully managing a sophisticated social event, and that kind of visibility could open doors for you professionally and personally." Dad's attempt to reframe the crisis as an opportunity had been particularly insulting because it revealed how little he understood about my actual professional goals and the kind of doors I was interested in having opened. The suggestion that managing one successful dinner party could somehow transform my career prospects had shown that he still viewed my work as a temporary phase that could be redirected toward more conventional pursuits if I could just gain exposure to the right social circles. But the real revelation had been his casual assumption that I had been underachieving due to lack of opportunity rather than deliberate choice. The implication that this event would finally give me a chance to show what I was really capable of had dismissed years of work building my design practice as inadequate preparation for the important work of impressing Riverside's social elite with my hostess skills. Standing in my parents' dining room, surrounded by people who had already committed me to responsibilities I hadn't agreed to take on, looking at planning materials for an event that represented everything I found exhausting about their social world, I had experienced a moment of absolute clarity about what was happening and what it meant for my relationship with my family. They hadn't asked me to help with Jessica's fundraiser because they trusted my judgment or valued my skills. They had assigned me to take over the event because they needed someone to execute Jessica's vision without question or modification, and they assumed I would be grateful for the opportunity to temporarily inhabit her more elevated social position. They didn't want my creativity or input, they wanted my labor in service of maintaining their reputation and social standing. The realization had been both heartbreaking and liberating. Heartbreaking because it had confirmed that their love for me was indeed conditional on my willingness to serve family interests even when those interests conflicted with my own well-being. Liberating because it had made the choice between family approval and personal integrity so stark that I couldn't continue pretending there might be a way to have both. I had looked around the room at these people I loved, taking in their expectant faces and their detailed plans for my day, and their obvious confidence that I would ultimately do what family loyalty required. And for the first time in my adult life, I had felt completely certain about what I needed to do. "I can't take over Jessica's fundraiser," I had said, my voice steady despite the trembling in my hands. "I understand this creates a difficult situation for everyone, and I'm sorry about that. But I can't abandon my own commitments to manage an event I had no part in planning, and I won't pretend to be someone I'm not in order to impress people whose approval I don't need." The aftermath of my refusal to take over Jessica's fundraiser had been swift and brutal, unfolding over the following week like a carefully orchestrated campaign designed to demonstrate the consequences of defying family expectations. What I hadn't anticipated was how my decision to finally establish boundaries would trigger a series of retaliatory actions that revealed the true nature of my relationship with my family and gave me the perfect opportunity to respond in kind. The first salvo had come from Mom, who had called me the morning after the fundraiser catastrophe to inform me that she had been forced to cancel the entire event, resulting in significant embarrassment for the family and financial disappointment for the hospital auxiliary. Her voice had carried the particular tone of martyrdom that she reserved for situations where she wanted to ensure I understood the full weight of consequences that she attributed directly to my selfishness. "Sarah, I hope you understand what your decision has cost this family. Jessica is devastated that months of her hard work have been wasted, the hospital auxiliary has lost thousands of dollars in expected donations, and our reputation in the community has been seriously damaged. People are asking questions about why we couldn't manage to keep our commitments, and I don't have good answers to give them. The attempt to make me responsible for a social disaster that had resulted from their poor planning and unreasonable expectations had been exactly the kind of manipulation I had been learning to recognize and reject. But what had surprised me was how little guilt I had felt about their crisis. The week of self-reflection had apparently immunized me against the emotional manipulation that had controlled my behavior for years. Instead of apologizing and offering to fix the situation somehow, I had found myself responding with a clarity that surprised both Mom and myself. "I'm sorry the event had to be canceled, but that wasn't my responsibility to prevent. If Jessica wanted a backup plan for emergencies, she should have arranged one in advance, rather than assuming I would drop everything to solve problems I didn't create." The conversation had escalated quickly from there, with Mom expressing shock at my apparently callous attitude toward family responsibilities, and me explaining that I had my own responsibilities that were equally important. But the real turning point had come when Mom had revealed information that she clearly hadn't intended to share in her anger about my continued resistance to family pressure. "Sarah, you need to understand that this family has done more for you than you seem to realize. Do you know that your father has been quietly helping to pay your rent for the past 2 years? Do you think that little apartment of yours is really affordable on your freelance income? We've been supporting you because we believed you were working towards something better, but if this is the gratitude we can expect, maybe it's time for you to learn what independence really costs." The revelation had hit me like a physical blow, not because I was devastated to learn about the financial assistance, but because I was furious to discover that my family had been secretly subsidizing my life, while simultaneously criticizing my choices and questioning my financial responsibility. The rent payments explained so much about their attitude toward my work and their expectations for my availability whenever they needed assistance. I had hung up the phone and immediately called my landlord to inquire about the payment arrangements for my apartment. The conversation had confirmed Mom's revelation and provided additional details that made the situation even more infuriating. Dad had been paying a portion of my rent for 2 years, apparently telling the landlord that it was temporary assistance while I established my business, and the payments had been structured to make it appear that I was paying the full amount myself. The discovery had reframed every conversation we'd had about my financial stability and career choices over the past 2 years. Every time they had questioned whether my freelance work was sustainable, they had known it wasn't covering my full expenses because they were secretly making up the difference. Every suggestion that I needed more reliable income had been made while they were actively preventing me from experiencing the natural consequences of my financial decisions. But what had enraged me most was the realization that they had been using this secret assistance as leverage, creating a situation where I was financially dependent on them, without my knowledge or consent, then expressing disappointment in my lack of gratitude for support I hadn't known I was receiving. They had constructed a trap that made my independence illusory, while preserving their ability to criticize my choices and demand my compliance with their expectations. The phone had rung again 20 minutes later, this time with Dad's number on the display. I had answered knowing that this conversation would be the one where they played their financial leverage card explicitly, and I had been prepared to respond in a way that would permanently alter our relationship dynamics. "Sarah, your mother told me about your conversation this morning, and I think we need to have a frank discussion about your situation. I've been helping with your rent because I believed you were working toward building something sustainable, but your recent behavior suggests that you're not taking your responsibilities seriously. If you can't be counted on to help family when we need you, then maybe you need to experience true financial independence." Dad's tone had been the calm, reasonable voice he used when delivering ultimatums disguised as helpful guidance. The message had been clear: comply with family expectations, or lose financial support that I hadn't known existed. But instead of feeling panicked, or grateful, or manipulated into submission, I had felt something crystallize inside me that was both angry and liberated. Dad, I appreciate that you've been helping with expenses, but I never asked for that assistance, and I certainly never agreed to accept it in exchange for being available whenever the family needs free labor. If you want to stop the rent payments, that's your choice, but you should know that I would have preferred to struggle honestly rather than accept help that came with strings I didn't know about. The conversation had continued for another 40 minutes, with Dad alternating between expressions of disappointment in my ingratitude and attempts to negotiate terms for continued financial support. But I had already made my decision during those first few minutes of clarity, and nothing he said could change the fundamental realization that their help had been a form of control rather than genuine assistance. By the end of the call, I had established terms that were probably different from what either of us had expected. I would take over my full rent payments immediately, which would require some significant adjustments to my lifestyle and work schedule, but would also free me from the obligation to be grateful for support I had never requested. Dad could stop the subsidies without any expectation that I would view his decision as punishment, because I would finally be operating with complete honesty about my financial situation. The week that followed had been a crash course in rapid business development and expense reduction. I had contacted every client I had worked with over the past 2 years to let them know I was available for additional projects, reached out to potential new clients I had been too comfortable to pursue aggressively, and raised my rates to levels that better reflected the value of my work. I had also looked for ways to reduce expenses without compromising my ability to do quality work. The scramble to replace Dad's rent assistance had been stressful but also oddly energizing, because it had forced me to approach my business with the urgency and focus that I had been lacking when financial pressure had been artificially reduced. Within a week, I had secured enough additional work to cover the rent increase, though it meant working longer hours and being more selective about the projects I could afford to take on. But the most unexpected consequence of the financial independence had been the psychological freedom that came with knowing I was supporting myself completely through my own efforts. For the first time in years, I had been able to look at my bank account and know that every dollar in it had been earned through work I had chosen to do, for clients who valued what I brought to their projects, in service of goals that I had set for myself. The second wave of family retaliation had come in the form of social exclusion, which had been more obvious but ultimately less effective than the financial pressure. Invitations to family gatherings had stopped arriving, updates about family news had ceased, and social media interactions with extended family members had disappeared, as if I had been collectively unfriended from the Mitchell family network. The silence had been intended to demonstrate what I would lose by refusing to prioritize family needs over personal boundaries, but instead, it had shown me how much energy I had been spending on relationships that required me to diminish myself in order to maintain them. Without the constant background stress of family judgment and expectation, I had found myself sleeping better, working more efficiently, and generally feeling more optimistic about my life and future. The third form of retaliation had been the most petty but also the most revealing. Jessica had apparently told her friends and social circle that I had refused to help during her medical emergency, creating a narrative where I appeared selfish and uncaring while she appeared to be the victim of family dysfunction. The story had spread through their social network, with the efficiency of gossip designed to generate sympathy for Jessica, while positioning me as the family disappointment who couldn't be counted on during times of crisis. Ordinarily, this kind of social reputation damage would have devastated me and sent me scrambling to repair relationships and correct misunderstandings. But the weeks of self-reflection and boundary setting had given me a different perspective on whose opinions actually mattered to me. The people who knew me well enough to make informed judgments about my character weren't part of Jessica's social circle anyway. And the people who were willing to condemn me based on one-sided stories from someone they wanted to support probably weren't people whose relationships I needed to preserve. The realization that I didn't actually care what Jessica's friends thought about me had been both liberating and slightly shocking. For years I had been trying to maintain acceptability across social circles that had never really accepted me anyway, worrying about the opinions of people who had never shown genuine interest in understanding who I was or what I was trying to accomplish. The freedom to stop caring about their approval had been like taking off shoes that had been too tight for so long that I had forgotten what comfortable walking felt like. But the most significant retaliation had come from an unexpected source. Tom, Jessica's husband, who had apparently decided that my refusal to drop everything for family emergencies represented a threat to the support system that his wife relied on. He had called me directly, something that had never happened before in our years of family relationship, to express his disappointment in my behavior and to make it clear that he viewed my recent choices as evidence of selfishness that was harmful to Jessica's well-being. "Sarah, I don't know what's gotten into you lately, but Jessica is really hurt by your lack of support during what's been a difficult time for her. She's always been there for you when you needed help, and she expected the same consideration when she was facing medical complications and needed family assistance." Tom's call had been particularly infuriating because it had been based on a completely fictional version of my relationship with Jessica, one where she had been consistently supportive of my goals, and I had been consistently selfish about hers. The suggestion that Jessica had always been there for me when I needed help had been so divorced from reality that I had wondered if he was thinking of a different sister entirely. "Tom, I'm sorry Jessica is hurt, but I think there's been some miscommunication about our family dynamics. Jessica has never been available when I've faced challenges, and I've never expected her to be because we have very different lives and priorities. I'm not sure what support you think she's provided, but I can't remember asking for help that she's given or receiving assistance that she's offered." The conversation had devolved quickly from there, with Tom insisting that I was rewriting history to justify my recent selfishness and me providing specific examples of times when I had needed support that had never materialized from Jessica or anyone else in the family. By the end of the call, it had become clear that Tom's understanding of our family relationships had been entirely based on Jessica's version of events, which apparently bore little resemblance to my experience of the same interactions. But Tom's call had also provided me with valuable information about how my family was interpreting my recent behavior changes. They weren't seeing my boundary setting as healthy personal growth or my financial independence as impressive achievement. They were seeing my refusal to be constantly available for their needs as evidence of moral deficiency, and my insistence on prioritizing my own goals as proof of selfishness that needed to be corrected. The realization that they would never interpret my growth in positive terms had been the final piece of clarity I needed to understand what my retaliation should look like. I couldn't change their perception of my choices, and I couldn't make them understand that healthy relationships required mutual respect and support. But I could stop participating in their system entirely, and I could make sure they understood that their attempts to punish me for establishing boundaries would have consequences they hadn't anticipated. My response to their coordinated campaign of financial, social, and emotional pressure had been simpler and more effective than anything they had deployed against me. I had stopped trying to maintain relationships that required me to accept unacceptable treatment, and I had started living my life as if their approval were completely irrelevant to my well-being and success. The freedom to stop caring about their opinions had been immediately apparent in how I approached my work, my social life, and my future planning. Without the constant background anxiety of family judgment, I had been able to pursue projects that genuinely excited me, rather than ones that might generate impressive-sounding updates for family gatherings. I had started accepting social invitations from people who valued my company for who I actually was, rather than declining them because I was worried about having time for family obligations. Most importantly, I had begun making plans for my future that reflected my actual interests and values, rather than ones that might eventually earn family approval. The energy I had been spending on trying to bridge the gap between what I wanted and what they wanted for me had been redirected toward building something that was entirely my own. The shift had been so dramatic that I had begun to understand how much of my adult life had been spent in a state of chronic stress and compromise that I had mistaken for normal experience. Without the pressure to constantly justify my choices to people who disapproved of them, I had discovered reserves of creativity and confidence that I hadn't known I possessed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.